And how's it going? And welcome to the Roll for Stats podcast. You will be joined by me, co-host No Fun Allowed, and my other co-host, Stan.
Hey guys.
Today's video will be talking about various things such as role-playing games, life, and whatever the frick else comes up. Today's rolled for stats character shall be determined by 1d10 plus 1d8 down the line. Let's go ahead and check out what this terrible monstrosity is, shall we?
Yeah. So, are you gonna be the one rolling this character up this time, or do you want me to go ahead and do these ever increasingly stressful rolls?
I like making you suffer a lot. That's a ton of fun.
That's fine. That is a-okay. So
there's a reason I'm no fun allowed around here.
Roll d10 plus. Let's see here.
1d10 plus 1d8. So the ceiling is 18.
Can I roll these dice in the same roll?
Yeah, you can. Absolutely.
D10. Is it comma d8 or just space?
I think it's a plus.
Let's see. So this is the first one.
Let's see it. This is strength 7.
Oh.
Woo! 7 strength.
Not a strength-based character.
No, not a strength.
Let's hope not. Let's hope 7 is not where it sits. You know, my last character was so good.
Yeah, absolutely. So with D10 plus D8, the ceiling is 18, but the floor is much lower. So let's go ahead and take a look at dexterity here.
This is dex.
11. Hey, you know, that's
not
better
a
than
negative
average.
stat.
Not a negative stat.
I just have a sick pit feeling in my stomach for con.
Oh, con baby. Oh! That's a 4! So whatever class you are, your HP is significantly lower than average.
3. Oh my god. So this is looking like a Circle of the Moon druid already.
Yeah, absolutely. It's looking like a spellcaster for sure.
It's looking like a oh my lord. All right, let's see here. This is gonna be is it int that's the 4th stat in 5th edition? I
yes,
think it
is, because we got that wrong the last time.
We did. Let's not mix that up again. Okay, so 14 in intelligence.
Hey,
it's looking salvageable.
Yes, it is. 9 wisdom.
This is not gonna make a good druid. Excuse me.
No, not a spellcasting druid anyway. And a 12 charisma.
This character is a hazard. This should be a war crime to force someone to play something like this.
With the 4 constitution.
Give me character sheet to put these. Here we go.
Yes, sir.
Oh my lord.
A 4 constitution is just, constitution is just one of those stats where you hate to put points into it because it doesn't actually do anything in regards of roleplay wise, but you need it because you just like HP. And it just sucks that con is just so baked into the mechanics of D&D. It has been for so long, but mind you, back in earlier editions of D&D, Constitution wasn't as impactful. There was, saves that were related to it, and HP was a much more bigger deal because if you dropped to 0 HP, you just flat outright died. But the difference between having, 5 HP and 7 HP wasn't as big as I feel like it is nowadays.
Well, I think that plays into older editions in D&D were a bit more combat focused, especially the earlier you get. A lot of the roleplay stuff was present, but it was built upon. And the systems that were at play were definitely more about just like surviving the fight, and not dying. But a 4 in Constitution is abysmal. It pretty much cripples any character that you play, because this is the worst thing about this character right now. My best stat is a 14, and one of the only classes that primarily uses intellect has the lowest hit die in the game. So it's gonna be.
If you go down the wizard route, you are going to be HP comparable to Dopey.
Oh, no. Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So
-3. So.
So at first level for any character, you typically take the full hit dice plus your Constitution modifier. However, in this case, it would be minus your Constitution modifier. So if you went down the wizard route, you would in fact actually have only 3
I'd have
HP.
3 HP. 3 HP at level 1. If you take average, which in 5th edition is 4, I get 1 health per level. I would actually have the same health as Dobie.
Yes.
I get 1 HP per level, and I start with... So at 3rd level wizard, I'd have 5 health.
Level wizard would have 5 health. And then you take that even further down the line, you have a 5th level wizard that only has 7 health. And it's just like, you start looking at all the other classes and you're just like, okay, that, 14 con barbarian or is already pushing 50 some odd HP. And then we just pan over to the wizard who's just gangly and sickly and
who's like next level might hit double digits.
But mind you, as per 5th edition rules, if you take your entirety of your health times 2 in a single hit, you would die. Meaning that as a level 1 character, specifically this wizard, if you took 6 HP of damage, you would die. And then you take that further down the line of, if you're a 3rd level guy, only have 5 HP, you take 10 points of damage in a single hit, you're dead. Which...
Con is an important stat. People undersell con. Now, you usually see a lot of builds that'll go like at least 12 con, which I think is pretty healthy. But I have an example of one of the games I'm DMing right now. We have a wizard who's got more HP than the rogue just because of the con that's present. Now, in 5th edition, I think they both have a d6 a hit die. So they're really not necessarily competing with a hit die difference. But it is strange to hear that the wizard out-healths someone in the party.
Absolutely. It's HP is just one of those things that you don't want to think about it because it doesn't impact what you want to do, really, because typically as a fighting type character, you're going to be up in the fight. And if you're going to be a spellcasting character, you're going to be in the back slinging spells. And if you are, a bounce in between, then you just bounce in between. And HP shouldn't affect your playstyle in that sense, but at the end of the day, it does, because you sit there and say, okay, I've only got 10 HP, and that orc is on average doing 10 points of damage. Do I risk staying up in the fight, or do I have to let someone else, run in there and make sure that I don't get ganked? And that comes up a lot, the idea of... It's hard to say if it's metagaming or not, whether you look at your HP as regards of... oh, do I play to the fact that I know I've only got this much health and I know the enemy does this much damage? Because if you don't play into it, and if you say, oh, that's metagaming, my character wouldn't think of it in that regard, then unfortunately that can lead to a bad time. If your game is hinging on you playing, and most important of all, everyone staying up and alive, then you sit there and not necessarily ruin the experience, but you definitely make it a different experience, and some people might not like that. Versus if you sit down and consider, okay, I've got this much health, they're doing this much damage, I need to act completely differently. And then you can sit there and say, oh, would my character actually know the implications of that? Yes or no? And either way is perfectly fine. You could easily justify the idea that I know that this orc is going to hit me hard, I don't want to be involved with that, and you have to seriously sit down and weigh what is fun for your table, what is good for your game, and consider, should HP actually be an idea that your characters would actually be pertinent to.
Well, and again, it is an easy, understandable, and immediately recognizable concept of you have health, right? But again, you deal as much damage at 1 HP as you do at full HP. So you don't have this kind of scaling back of, oh, you're at half health, you're not attacking as easily, or you're having trouble running, or you take some penalty. And the truth of the matter is, if you want to play in a realistic style game, you can implement rules like that. But it's, like you just said, what's going to be fun? Because while those sound kind of interesting, a lot of those mechanics feel very anti-fun. And if the players aren't enjoying those types of rules that you set up on the table, then you have to kind of consider, is this the right group I'm DMing for, or are these just rules that maybe aren't very applicable to fifth edition? Um, there's Homebrewing 5e has some drawbacks because sometimes things can interact in a balance sense in a very strange way. And in a lot of cases, if you're not careful and you're editing 5e, it's very easy to make your players overpowered in ways that you really didn't anticipate.
Or maybe even underpowered. There
Well,
it
go ahead,
go on.
sorry.
No, you go on.
I was going to say, and there are some cases in 5e where you do see curling back of rules. Necromancers typically
Oh
need
yes.
some kind of tweaking, because if they're really played rules as written, they can potentially break your game. Um, so you have to kind of be careful about where you're going to adjust rules, how much you're going to adjust. I always err on the side of, adjust a little bit and kind of maybe have some scenarios where you sit down and you put yourself in the shoes of the player, and you try to figure out, how does this play, how does this work, because it can be very jarring to players if you introduce a certain rule in a campaign and then midway through the campaign change your mind, and it's something that is very major. It's a very major rule, instead of just a small ruling on maybe how one spell operates. So you really want to be careful as you're going under the hood in 5e to make sure that you're accounting for how many unforeseen interactions could this change potentially have, um, which is sometimes hard to do.
Absolutely. I think one thing I've learned over the course of however much I've tried, janking with the rules is I think something to consider is if you want to implement a new rule, instead of throwing it into your campaign, go ahead and throw it into a one shot that you run and allow it to be tested, even if it's for a little bit, because you might look at something that you've written on paper or you found something online or whatever the case may be, and you might think it sounds awesome, but then once you actually see it implemented real time, either it sucks or it's OPOP. And at least giving it a try, in the actual field is a great way to do that. And especially if it's a one shot, then you don't care about the implications about the game. If you put rules into a campaign that you're running, and then later down the line you realize, okay, this needs to change, especially if it is a idea or some type of effect that your players have, and you have to go and nerf it, that sucks. It always sucks to get nerfed. People are always going to resent that no matter what. Even if they do understand that it is reasonable that something is nerfed, it always sucks to go from strong to chump. And you have to seriously sit down and weigh those ramifications of your campaign, which is why I recommend at least trying out these rules once before trying to implement them.
Well, I think
And
that.
yeah,
Go ahead.
no, you.
No, I was going to say, I think that's in the first episode we talked about, if you're new to DMing, run a lot of one shots or run smaller campaigns. And I think if you have certain ideas that you want to test out, running a lot of one shots is a really, really good idea. You know, because once you get into that long-term campaign, that it needs to stay consistent. Consistency is so important, and it can really take your players out of it if rules are changing here and there, and maybe you forget something changed after you've taken time to learn a set of homebrew, and it can be a little jarring. But I think if you want to try out certain things, feel free to talk to your players about it openly, and just say, look, there is something I'm interested to try out. You know, you know, would you guys want to try it out? Do you guys want to maybe roll up some new characters in a one shot and see how we'd like it in the one shot without it actually impacting the campaign? Because I think that could be something that you could do, and they could be kind of aware of a rule and learning the new rule and say, yeah, we don't like it or we do like it, without affecting any progress in the campaign. Because once you progress in the campaign, you cannot retcon. I know some people, some people will retcon stuff, but you really shouldn't retcon stuff in your campaigns.
Absolutely. The idea that there is no permanency will creep into your players' minds if you go back and say, hey, this didn't happen. Because we play these games acting like everything is do or die. We play these games like, thinking that every decision we make is the final decision. And if that loses its weight, if your players think that they can go ahead and say something stupid in front of an NPC and just say, oh, no, that didn't happen. Or if you start going down the line of, hey, last session I flubbed a whole bunch of rules. Let's go ahead and just pretend like that session never happened. Then it starts weighing in on, okay, maybe this doesn't matter. Maybe that doesn't matter. And you start to lose that being grounded in reality effect that we strive for. We are, of course, playing a fantasy game or a sci-fi game, whatever role-playing game you're playing. We're playing games, but at the same time, we want there to be that impact. We want that permanency to it. And just getting rid of that little by little is going to severely affect the end game because, like I just mentioned, if you say that you personally as the DM messed up a whole bunch of rules, yeah, that sucked that you messed up a whole bunch of rules, but guess what? Those were your rules and you called them at a moment's notice and you just move on. You don't go back. You can't, because then later down the line you're going to do a new ruling at some point and your players are going to say, hey, I don't like that ruling. Screw that. Maybe we should go back and redo that. And then you'll get into those discussions, and hopefully not arguments. Hopefully they're only just discussions. And that sucks. Don't play into that. Definitely keep into consideration that this game needs to be moving forward at all times and never moving back.
Yeah, there's a huge importance in the rules of a game. I mean, we all come to the table, we all agree to abide by the rules of the game. I mean, rules, I think, are what make games like this fun, because it sets a consistent standard for which things happen, and you learn the rules, and your characters exist within the rules, and you come to understand them, and there becomes a consistency for how things happen. And as soon as that changes, you're absolutely right about losing the permanency effect. Because, yeah, it's just like, well, what matters then? The DM, and the DM can always rule things the way he sees fit. But I think if the DM does so, he needs to be consistent in the way that he rules those things. You shouldn't say, yes, I think that this rule needs to be this way, and then 5 sessions later say, yeah, let's change it back, or I just changed my mind. It doesn't feel good for the players, and it's there needs to be some way that you can kind of say, well, look, if there was a mistake made, that's fine, and just say, look, I made a mistake. This is actually how this spell is supposed to work, but we're unfortunately we're not going to go back and redo that encounter that was 3 sessions ago, because there's too many implications. You can't regain that lost time, and I don't know really any players that really want to sit down and redo something like that. People don't like to go back and do that. Hopefully that's not an issue for people at their table if there is something that happens like that. But I mean, and if you catch it early enough in a combat encounter, if it's like the same turn that it's happening and you catch it, that's a different story, But if it's something that's happened in the past and is already done, then it's too late.
Absolutely. And that also leads into another thing, is the fact that you are an arbitrator of the rules. Whether you be a DM or a player, you're both abiding by the rule set at the table. And something you need to consider is the rules are there for us to read in our off time and to, absorb in our off time. Don't waste in-game time looking up rules. It sucks if you don't know a rule off the top of your head, but sitting there and cracking open the book and spending the next 15 minutes of the session just trying to figure out, okay, when it means falling, if I fall exactly 11 feet, is that, how much damage. Don't don't waste your time, because you sit down to play this game for however many hours, whether it be 1, 2, 3, 4 hours, whatever the case may be. You sit down to play in that time and looking up rules and trying to discuss how rules should be interpreted just wastes so much time that could have been spent having fun. And yeah, of course, if you have to make a split decision right there, and if it is a decision that sucks, then it will suck for a little bit. But I promise you, if you make a decision right then and there, just saying, hey, I rule right now that this is how this spell works, I rule right now that this is how this interaction works, then it'll be fine, because your players aren't going to walk away from that session thinking to themselves, oh, we wasted a whole bunch of time discussing something. We actually just played through the game. And then afterward, go ahead and go back and look at that rule that you misinterpreted. Go ahead and look at that spell that has, 3 paragraphs of text that you have to sift through. That all that stuff should be meant outside of the session, because we want to have fun for that small window of time we can get all these human beings together. Don't waste that time.
Well, I think especially within the context of, you are needing to make decisions. I think one thing that you can do is familiarize yourself with your PCs and see what abilities do they have, what spells do they have, because that's usually where rules lawyering or uncertainties may come up. And if you know what your players have in their kit, and you kind of study up on that, and you're very sure about the interactions that they have within the world that you're running, you'll usually be able to make an educated guess, even if it's not something that is, explicitly written. There's a lot of stuff that there aren't rules about that you're kind of meant as a DM to make rules up for, you know. But there's a lot of stuff that does have a concrete, definition of what is exactly going to happen. I think sometimes you do, if it's, I think it really depends on what it is, because some things, if you have, like, we do most of our D&D on Roll20, and if we have, a very easy way just to look at like the whole spell description, there's usually that your source is already right there. You already kind of have an idea of what's going to happen. But like you said, sometimes you just need to make a ruling as a DM, and it may not be the exact way it's supposed to happen, but you can go back and refamiliarize yourself with something that happened that session, and moving forward, you can say, I did run this encounter wrong. Sorry guys, because there's nothing wrong with admitting that something was run incorrectly, and that you learned from your mistake. I think some DMs are too afraid to maybe fess up to that. But everyone learns. Everyone's learning. You will, as a DM, you will continue to learn different interactions and different things and the way players interact. And there may be some rules that come up that you're like, man, I've never thought about that. I really don't know. And there is some concrete, there might be some concrete rules about whatever it is that you're having a question about. But again, if it's going to take you like a full 5 to 10 minutes to look up a specific rule, maybe make it up on the fly. But yeah, I think if you reasonably have the sources there and you know where to look and you can get to it quickly, that's okay. But yeah, you don't want to be dragging game time down looking up rules for every single thing. And that's also in part a responsibility of your players too, to understand how their abilities interact as well. Because if they don't know their ability interacts in a certain way or doesn't interact in a certain way, that's kind of on them. That's their responsibility and knowledge for playing that character.
Absolutely. As DMs, we are sort of expected to know so much of the rulebook. And at the end of the day, players are only expected to know how their character operates. But that doesn't have to be the case. if you get at least that one rules lawyer in the group, rules lawyer isn't necessarily bad, but if you have that one player in the group that's really helping out police all of the other players and even helping yourself out, that can be a wealth of, fortune there, because there's a ton of rules in these books. That player's handbook is 300 some odd pages. This DMG is several hundred pages. You aren't expected to memorize it all. There's just way too much to consider. You should, of course, memorize the day-to-day stuff that is always going to come up, such as, okay, I know that to roll an attack roll, I have to roll a d20. Simple as that, right? You should know these simple things that are always coming up, but you aren't expected to know the very niche things. You aren't expected to know that falling damage is capped to 200 feet. You aren't expected to know that, this phantasmal killer spell operates in this way. You aren't expected to know all that, and that's perfectly fine. Just always consider what is always readily going to happen, because at any given point, you can just go ahead and look at your player's character sheet and see what they got going on there, and then go ahead and look at the monsters that you have going on, all the traps that your players are going to be going up against, and whatever gameplay implications that are going to arise from it. Several things are going to slip through the cracks, and that's perfectly fine. But once again, admitting to your mistakes later on is perfectly fine as well. In fact, that's actually very good to be transparent with your players. When you mess up and you say, hey, I ruled it this way, but in reality, it should be this other way. And that can just be taken as a one-off, okay, that was a mistake. But if you want to get a little creative with it, you can also bake that into the roleplay. You can say that, okay, you shouldn't have been able to shove that giant because of, I should have been able to roll a different dice or whatever. But you can say, okay, you did shove that giant. Maybe there was a surge of power that welled through you at a certain point. Maybe that giant had something in the twinkle of his eye and maybe, had something go on. And that is the reason why you were able to shove them. Whatever a case rises that the rules were changed, you can get creative with it. And it doesn't have to have any mechanical implications later down the line. It can just simply be that it was a one-time thing, because hopefully it is a one-time thing. Hopefully you learn from your mistakes as time goes on, and that is just all that we do about these role-playing games. We learn from our mistakes, we move on, and we get a better game because of it. If we gave up at the first notice, then we wouldn't have any games to play now, would we?
Well, failure is the best teacher. And I think there are many people who are afraid to mess up, or, afraid that it won't be a perfect experience. But part of that is managing expectations about what you can do, and setting up encounters and setting up, an experience that that you are going to be able to deliver on. And if you do that, I think your players will enjoy it. You don't want to mislead your players about what your campaign is going to be about, but you certainly need, I think if this is a group you've played with consistently and you've DM'd for multiple times, they probably know what to expect from you, and you know what to expect from yourself. Now, if it's your first time DMing and they know it's your first time DMing, that's okay too. They don't expect you to know every single thing, but you will, have opportunity to learn the rules. Hopefully, as you're learning it, you'll be a lot more interested, and it'll kind of grab you, and you'll realize that there is a lot to D&D, and there's a lot of cool different interactions, and there's a lot of opportunity to write some really great stories. And you have great tools at your disposal, and the more you learn, the better you are to utilize those tools, and the better campaign you'll be able to craft.
Absolutely. I've got this DMG right next to me, and every single time I open that thing up, even though I've read it cover to cover multiple times, every time I look through it, I discover something new, something that I must have overlooked, or something that didn't really connect with me at the time. But I look in there and I see these variant rules, or I see these different ways to run campaigns, or I see these different set pieces. And then it finally clicks with me. Oh, hey, I've never ran with, using these, obscure items before. I've never ran a campaign using this background setting. And that gets me thinking. And it gets me thinking about all the different things that can be going on here, and that definitely it influences me anyway to making a different sort of encounter later down the road, whether it be the very next session that I'm running or several sessions down the line where I jot down a little note here that says, use this variant rule or use this, obscure thing that not many people would think of because, once again, these are big books. You aren't expected to remember them all, and that's perfectly fine. And speaking of jotting things down here, let's go ahead and take a look at what this poor, wretched creature we are looking at is. What is this?
It's going to be wizard, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
An extremely paper-thin character. I'm going with Rock Gnome to get that int to 16.
16 int, not bad, not bad.
And what was my secondary? Hold on, I just had it. Let me get back to that page. But yeah, I'm gonna go wizard. I don't know what wizard I'm gonna go. I honestly, I kind of want to go divination. I know it's a character that I made divination
in your future.
I can see the death in my future, but the dice manipulation is really, really fun.
Absolutely.
Although it's not a halfling, which you don't get luck, the halfling luck, which is like it goes into it even more. But that is like a very well-known kind of memey character. But listen, it is a good build for a reason.
It is a good build for a reason.
It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. So I think I'm going to have to look at the different wizard subclasses a little more. Now, let me go back to Rock Gnome. Rock Gnome gets a bonus. Oh, a bonus to con. Look at that.
But it's only +1.
It's too bad it's still -3.
Still negative.
Whoop-de-doo. Whoop-de-doo.
But just think about this, right? No. This Rock Gnome, he's sickly, he's pale. But lo and behold, you can take an ability score increase that makes your HP shoot up through the roof. Wouldn't that be incredible?
I could also just take tough, and it would just be. That is when that feat's already very good in 5th edition.
Yes, it is.
But that is a situation where that feat is the best because getting the 2 HP. It's so big when you only get 1 health every level.
You're little.
All the gnomes.
That's a 200% increase.
I googled emaciated gnomes, and all I'm getting are the leper gnomes from World of Warcraft.
Yep.
So I don't know. What he might end up being a leper gnome.
He definitely has the makings of a leper gnome, like mechanist or whatever they are.
Here we go. This is him. But if I could make him thinner. I'll give it a second. I have a very slow internet and it's sending the picture, but yeah, he's going to be a gnome. Looking at wizard though,
what is cool about gnome is look at that. All of your mental saves have advantage. So, even though your wisdom and charisma is only a +1, it's still at advantage.
Yeah, that is very good. And unfortunately is one of the least common rolled save, I think, in 5th edition.
True. But we can compare, of course, with our other character here. Once the roll for stats team goes up against Mind Flayers, this guy's gonna do pretty well.
Yeah, I will say when int saves are pertinent, they typically are very important to make the save. Your character does not do well if they fail int saves.
No, they do not.
They usually are pretty punishing. I don't know if there are any int save spells that force creatures to make int saves. There may be.
There is. They added a few Xanathars, for example, being and Tasha's as well. They added one of the biggest ones. It's the fireball that makes your opponents roll -d6 on all of their attack rolls, saving throws. I'm blanking on the spell's name right this current second, but it's a 5th level spell that is literally just a fireball damage wise, but it's an int save, and if they fail, they have to subtract a d6 from all of their attack rolls and saving throws, which is pretty big.
Oh, I don't even get an arcane tradition at level 1, so this character's already pretty much done now. He's just gonna be. Oh no! I have to look at the spells that he gets. That's what I need to fill out. I do get Arcane Recovery and Spellcasting at 2 first level spells and 3 known cantrips.
Not bad. You know, wizards get a lot going for them at level 1, and then they get a lot going from at level 2. They're definitely a class that starts off pretty much doing what they want to do, which is something that's interesting. Is because not I mean, majority of the classes actually don't start off doing what they want to do. Like, for example, being the fighter. If you definitely know that you're going to be that, awesome samurai, or if you want to be that ranger style fighter, you don't start off as that. You start off like slowly becoming that, but it takes a few levels, specifically usually 2 level 3, to finally get what you want. And
yeah,
it's really interesting to think that some of these classes, like clerics and sorcerers, they're already starting off and they already are what they are, but they just get a little bit better at it. Versus, for example, being barbarian, pretty much like the martial classes in a sense. Paladins in particular.
Martial classes get it at 3rd.
Yeah, paladins in particular are really weird because you're already getting at level 1 you have no spellcasting at all as a paladin. Then level 2 you do get spellcasting, and specifically through your deity. And then at 3rd level is where you finally swear your oath and start getting your god-specific abilities. Which it's weird to think about in a, I don't know if it's weird in a design philosophy, let's say, but you definitely have to somehow bake that into the role play of the character. Why is it that, if you're just going around killing goblins, why all of a sudden do they take a knee and then say something out loud and then their god just gives them powers? You definitely have to consider the roleplay implications of that when you are running the character. I'm sort of facing that right now with specifically you guys in my campaign. We have a cleric and a paladin, and the paladin just leveled up. And I've already got some things cooking up on the side here, but it's definitely, you have to consider, why are they leveling up?
And I think you want to, huh?
No, well, I'm basically like, I think I can take us into another topic here. Is leveling up is a funny mechanic because when you are, let's say, playing by XP, then you are just simply
XP is such a trap.
XP is a trap. If you are running it by XP, then you go ahead and say, all right, I go out into the jungles and I kill goblins and I kill monsters, I kill whatever else. Then all of a sudden, I get a lot better. And why I say a lot better is, if you take a look at either other systems, other 5th edition, not other 5th editions, but other editions of D&D, a lot of the time leveling up wasn't nearly as impactful. But in 5th edition in particular, every single level up nearly doubles your strength. In fact, specifically, from going from 4th level to 5th level, your power level goes like nearly 3 times its strength. It is insanely huge.
There are massive plateaus, and it's very unique to 5th edition. I can't speak about 4th. I really didn't play 4th edition very much, but I don't think most people who actively play D&D did play 4th edition. Well, at the time they may have tried it out, but I don't think many people play it today.
No.
But for the most part, it was a very smooth transition. Spells used to scale based on your spellcaster level. So if you were 5th level wizard and just got Fireball, it would do 5d6 damage. But if you were an 8th level wizard and cast Fireball, it would do 8d6. So there was some natural progression, even a little bit more diversified amongst a lot of the things that players got, specifically abilities and spells, usually scaled with your level. But in 5th edition, the scaling, at least for spells, is tied to the spell slot you cast it at. Well, a 5th level wizard getting an 8d6 Fireball, it's a pretty that's a pretty big thing. And
you go from a 4th level wizard, their best spell is like Shatter, which only does like 4d8 or something. Like it's not impactful, like not nearly so much as Fireball.
Chromatic Orb is pretty strong as well, but Shatter's AoE. Exactly, Shatter's AoE, Fireball is AoE, and the damage jump is massive. And I think, in a system specifically, kind of onto my comment about XP, and you ran an XP-based campaign and saw this, it runs away from you.
Yes, it does.
You all of a sudden are realizing like, wow, they killed that encounter and they're already like a quarter of the way next to the next level, and they're a level ahead of this area that I intended to anyway. And you can sometimes run yourself into situations where you're like, okay, am I only going to give XP for combat encounters, or am I also going to give XP out for roleplay? And that becomes a fickle thing. How do you determine how much XP you're going to give to a player for something that they did? You know, are you going to give 200 XP for one action and then 500 for another? And then maybe one of the players feels like they're like, hey, I did more and maybe I deserve more. And you start getting this weird quantification of how valuable are my actions in not just like a roleplay context, but how much XP do I think I can get out of doing something like this? And sometimes that's a bad mentality to put your players into. But I think being able to actively track your XP in a role playing game can sometimes be distracting for the wrong reasons. But when you do Milestone, you decide, you know. And typically, sometimes you're like, okay, I gotta give it to them here. They've been doing a lot of stuff. They just, they just killed a big boss encounter. It's been 12 sessions since the last level up. Yeah, they deserve it. And they don't see it coming. And well, they kind of see it coming. Sometimes they're like, oh man, are we gonna level up from that? And there's an anticipation of not knowing. And then when they do get it, it's all the sweeter.
Absolutely. And well, I mean, I guess this applies to every single edition or whatever, but whenever you run a game purely based on XP, and let's say you are giving out XP for roleplay and exploration and whatever else, you are automatically sitting down and saying, okay, this is the scope of the campaign. If I'm giving out XP, then either one, I have to consider what is the level going to be of the end game, and two, if you don't consider that, then you have to consider, okay, if I want them to be level 3, let's say, by the time they get here, they need to go up against X many number of encounters. Because if you are not running Milestone, then you have to sit down and actually physically math it out. Which can be a great way to limit the scope of your campaign, so that way you aren't sitting down and just going off the complete rails and throwing way more at them or way less at them. Planning ahead is a good thing, but it does, in a way, restrict you. You do have to sit there and say, okay, if they are level 1, then, and I want them to get level 2, they need to go up against either 4 encounters that are pretty freaking hard, or they have to go up against 10 encounters that are a bit easier, and these are spread out over time. You have to sit down and physically math out this path, which can be a blast. It can certainly be a way to sit down and consider all this stuff. But the other thing to consider is that, as previously mentioned, I did run a fairly large campaign that was purely XP based, and I can easily tell you, XP at the very least in 5th edition is sadly wrong a lot of the times. If you have a group of 4 players and they spread out the 4 XP equally, then, it's a little bit more fair-ish to a degree, except for the fact that certain monsters are not worth their XP, whether they are way too giving in their XP for how weak they are, or they are way too powerful for the XP that they are. The most perfect example of that being, we had 7 players go up against 4 T-Rexes. And
this encounter.
Yeah, this is a classic encounter my players always love to bring up. 7 of my players went up against 4 T-Rexes. They killed the T-Rexes, no problem there. 1 or 2 of them went down, but it wasn't that deadly.
As I recall, it was more like there were more like 6 people down, but
who's counting, right?
Who's counting?
So they take out these T-Rexes, no one dies. And then I sit down and think to myself, okay, none of them died. It was somewhat close to some degree, but, no one died. And that's kind of the big deal out of it. No one died. And because of how XP is specifically for like the T-Rex, which is the CR8 creature, and there's 4 of them, so there's an XP multiplier, I go down and sit there and distribute the XP. If I had given them the full XP, all of them would have at least leveled up once, and some of them would have leveled up twice. And that is just a weird thing to consider, that you can get into an encounter that on paper is super deadly, but when it comes down to the actual mechanics of it, it wasn't nearly as deadly as it was. And then some people would double level up. It's weird. You have to sit down and seriously consider, like, there is some monsters that don't make sense, and it also, of course, really depends on the size of your group. That is probably one of the bigger things.
The action economy is extremely important. Like, once you start running 6+ players, or even like more, I would say 6 or 7 players, the action economy begins to get out of hand, because you as the DM have to consider how strong are the monsters I'm introducing, how many of them are there going to be, and is this combat encounter going to feel cumbersome because I'm having to balance for having quite a lot of players. And there's ways to do it very creatively and still make it feel worthwhile. But you have to consider that once that power creep sets in, especially within an XP-based campaign, if you have players that are leveling up once and maybe even twice from single encounters, now that encounter that they just fought that may have been close will not be next encounter or next time. So then you have to throw a stronger encounter at them, and it snowballs. And before you know it, you've got a ton of high-level characters that, you've thrown too many encounters at. You can't unfeed your players XP. In older editions, you could, because there were effects that would drain levels. There were effects that you could spend XP as a resource.
Yep.
Some spellcasters could create items, as they did, they would use a little bit of XP or scribe scrolls. But those types of mechanics I don't think exist within 5th edition.
Not at all.
So XP, I would definitely say do not run like a big campaign that's heavily combat focused with XP. I absolutely suggest people run Milestone. But again, that depends on the type of DM you are and the type of group you're running for.
I think another thing to consider too is you can run an absolute hybrid of Milestone and XP. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to air quote reward your players by allowing them to get into fights or go through role-playing encounters and giving them XP. But the specific milestones of the campaign, you are where normally they would level up if they reached a certain location. Instead of saying you automatically level up, instead you just replace that milestone with, okay, take a look at their character sheets. Okay, you reach this destination, you get 700 XP. Bam. And, if your players like those numbers, if they like seeing that XP bar go up and up, then that's a perfectly acceptable trade there. But once again, if you are playing with XP, you do have to consider there is a scope to your campaign. You can only throw in so many encounters. You can only allow them to do so much. Or you're going to have to go through this thing of your players sit there and say, oh man, we're actually only 1,000 XP away. Maybe we should start going around and, just start killing things because we really want to level up. You have to seriously consider your group when doing XP, and that is definitely something that, once again, it takes time as a DM, and as a group, if you discover if that is what you want. And there is, I think, specifically nowadays, a lot more people are in the Milestone camp than XP camp. And, it really just depends on your group. It depends on the system that you're running. It depends on the scope and scale of your campaign. There is a lot of variable factors here. And, Milestone is just so simple. It is just so easy to sit there and say, once they kill this bad guy, they level up. Once you reach this location, you level up. It is just so much easier. And we also talked about this earlier, but it is rewarding. If your players don't exactly know when the next level up is, and then you hand it to them, that's great. But at the same time, you can also dangle that in front of them. You can say, okay, this campaign is using Milestone, and throughout the course of the campaign, you say, okay, there's this big bad evil guy right here, and you feel like you would, grow stronger in your experiences if you defeated them. And that's telling your players, hey, there is this flag on this character, and if you kill them, you get a level up. and that can be rewarding as well. But there's no universal code or law to this thing. You have to sit down and discover what kind of group you have. Do you have a group that needs milestone, XP, or some sort of hybrid in between? And I think that's going to bring us into our next little topic here of we're talking about what we like to see or what we see in our games right now in regards of the games that we run and the things that we see and do here. And we haven't gone into any specific modules because we don't want to introduce any spoilers here because this is a podcast for everyone. But what do we want to see next from D&D? And what do I mean by what do we want to see next from D&D? I'm talking about what do we want to see in regards of a module, what do we want to see in regards of a setting, and what do we want to see from 6th edition?
So I think that kind of looking forward and kind of looking at what we have in 5th edition, right? We have lots of locations, and not all of them are on the Sword Coast. In fact, I think only a couple of them are primarily run on the Sword Coast of Faerun.
For as much as people complain about a lot of the adventures being on the Sword Coast, a lot of them don't necessarily take place on the Sword Coast. So
I think there's
a lot of variety.
It's become maybe a little bit, I'm not going to say a tired setting, but a very, very, very familiar one. And I think sometimes people want to see other locations, especially in modules, and that's how those locations are really breathed life into. You can always have someone who, or you yourself, can run a campaign in a specific location, but there is something very fun about knowing that this is official canonical content that's being produced and does interact with the consistent world in Forgotten Realms that's existed for quite a while now. Yeah, I think there's a lot of places to go. I know the 5th edition map is a bit different than the old 3rd edition map because of the Spell Plague, but I know there's a lot of places east. I don't think there are any adventures run in Thay. I don't think that any have been run in Mulhorand or Unther. I don't know how those settings are doing in 5th edition. Let me look up a map for this.
There is not a module, but there is, I mean, I guess it technically is a module. One of the Yawning Portal adventures does take place in Thay.
Oh, does it?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I would like to see it more as a whole campaign piece and something that's maybe a little more fleshed out. Because it is a very interesting location. There have been some games that happen in Thay. There's a lot of source material about Thay, and it could be very fun. But there's again, like, Forgotten Realms is so diverse. Here we go. Here's a good map. Let me send this one to you, Trevor, for reference.
Yeah, I mean, the Red Wizards of Thay in particular, they are a villain that crops up in a decent amount of the modules here. And yeah, we over the course of all these modules, if you read all of them, you do get a decent amount of information on Thay, and you do get decent information on what they're doing and why they're doing it. But of course, we don't get any information on what is actually going back at home. We don't get any information on the big bads that are on around there, and there is certainly a lot to be left, to the imagination. And that is purely because they don't want to have to go down and sit there and say, okay, like we're looking at a map of all of Faerun here. And admittedly, yes, the entirety of all the campaigns so far have only been up and down the Sword Coast, a little bit north, a little bit to the east, and specifically much further down south, specifically Chult. So there is a lot to this world. There's a huge old map of this world here, and we get a small sliver of it. And that makes me wonder, that makes me consider, in all the previous editions, of course, we've had adventures that have taken us all over the place. But 5th edition has, admittedly, purposely reined itself in. It has purposely, basically, shrunk in size, and they don't want to expand out to absolutely every single location because They don't want to pump out modules every month like they have before. They don't want to release the settings for every little location like they have before. They want to keep it smaller, but somehow grand in scale.
Well, I think it's less is more, which makes sense. You definitely don't want to have so much out there that it is daunting to get into the setting. Because if you, let's say you've never played D&D and you look at some of the older edition source books, you're like, oh, that's a lot of information. Do I need to know all that? And the truth is, no, you don't. A lot of it has to do, I mean, if you are playing a character that is from that location, maybe you could spend a little time familiarizing yourself with some of the information about the setting. But it's very easy for you to play a character that isn't from that location and probably wouldn't be if we're talking about some place that's more localized. Like, how likely is it in, Waterdeep Dragon Heist is your character to actually be from Waterdeep? Well, they could be, or they couldn't be, or they couldn't be. They don't need to be. And it's likely they might not be. Waterdeep is a city that has people from all walks of life coming through it. So, you have to kind of know what you're building your character into. But I am a fan of what they did in other editions, though. I will say that I liked how there were entire books that just kind of outlined the culture of the city. And there's specifically one campaign I'm building is in right now, and there's a nice second edition manual that has a lot of information about it. And I run my campaigns back in like the third edition setting, so it's more pertinent. But it's very nice to sit down and say, look, I can reference this stuff, and I can fill it in as I like. I don't need to have all of these storefronts in my campaign, but the options are there, and there is a framework already in place. And I think making those set pieces, while they may not have as much practical use as Wizard would like, I think that they are very, very fun to get into. And you can create a very, very beautifully fleshed out and world-builded setting through things like that. And a lot of the world building they're doing now in 5th edition is through their modules, which is fine. But they are visiting a lot of familiar locations, which I think is good.
Yeah, specifically in the past 3 entries we've seen so far, they have now started adopting the moniker of the title is first and foremost a location. For example, being the first one in the series was Waterdeep Dragon Heist and Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Then Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. And then now we have Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden. They are definitely playing into the fact that they know that there are these iconic names that old school veterans are going to recognize, and maybe even new people are going to recognize because they're just so iconic. And I think it's really important that they are drawing upon those. Even though, well, I will say in regards of Waterdeep, of course, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, that makes sense that it's called Waterdeep Dragon Heist because it takes place in Waterdeep. But Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage, yeah, I mean, you could have called it something else. It doesn't really matter, though. But, I really like these. I really like the fact that they are showing off the world through these modules as well, because I am always a fan of you personally not being from the location that you're adventuring in. I like the idea all the time that my players don't know where they are or what's going on or whatever the case may be, because both their player and the character are connected as one. They are both lost in the sauce. They're both discovering the mystery that's located all around this land. Because I know there's a ton of people that, for example, Rime of the Frost Maiden's coming out, or just came out, and people sit there and say, okay, my character's from Icewind Dale. DM, what do I know? DM, I would know this person. DM, I would... And I personally don't like that, because you have to dedicate a lot of time to sitting there thinking to yourself, if someone is from a location, if they are from Schult or you're playing Tomb of Annihilation, if they are from Icewind Dale and they're from, Icewind Dale, you have to sit there and consider how much would they actually know, and is it going to impact the game? And you have to do this weird balancing act of, I don't want to give them everything, but if they're from here, there's obviously some things that they would know. So I usually just try and remove that from the equation entirely. I like the idea that people show up to a foreign land for the first time and get to interact with everyone for the first time. And you get to build up those relationships both as a player and as a character. And I think that there is certainly a idea here that you can, of course, have people from these settings, and it works perfectly fine. I mean, a perfect example being, I keep on harping on this, Icewind Dale. If your players are from Icewind Dale, then you do get that awesome feeling of your players being connected to the world around them. That they are definitely grounded in the area that they are in, and it certainly helps them out with, immersing themselves in the world around them if they already know. But we keep on harping on this over and over again. It really comes down to the fact that you have to know your group. If your players like the idea of the mystery involved, if they like the shock and awe of exploring a world for the very first time, then don't have your players from the location of whatever module that you're playing in. But if there's a lot of exposition that you want to get rid of, if there is, your players don't want to be involved in that mystery of not knowing what's going on, then go ahead and just have them from the location. And you can go ahead and just slip them a whole bunch of notes. And these notes will say, okay, you would know these people, you would know that there's this location, you would know these rumors, and you would definitely know this is true, you would definitely know this is false. And that could be a ton of fun as well. That adds to the world building of your campaign of what do people know and what do people not know. So in regards to me, I love all of the modules so far. I think they all have amazing stories to tell. I think they all have awesome set piece locations and all that. But for me in particular, I think a module that I would love to see would be a module that takes place in the Moonshae Isles. We have not touched the Moonshae Isles really in 5th edition, other than there's a tiny little blurb about it in the Sword Coast Adventures guide, and there is alluded to something in Ghost of Saltmarsh. But I think a little adventure that takes place in the Isles could be fantastic, because that can get your players involved with, a whole bunch of different terrain styles. There could be jungles, forest, rivers, lakes, mountains, hills, and I really like the idea that your players are moving around this tiny little land, and I'm sure there's a lot of fun themes that you can throw in there. I'm trying to think of all the themes off the top of my head. We've had the theme of, an everlasting winter. We've had themes of a death curse. We've had themes of just going out to explore. Themes of giants doing some terrible thing to the world. I'm just trying to think, what kind of theme I'd want to see for a Moonshae Isles campaign.
From my understanding is the Moonshae Isles have a lot of Celtic influences within the Isles culture.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine, actually, from South Africa, he's very, very familiar with the Moonshaes, and he had a real cool idea to build a campaign. And the idea is that you're, I think that we had a couple different ideas, but you're you're going there with a group of people, and there's kind of a little settlement there that's, maybe like a little fort or a colony, and there's people that are settling there, and you have to go and kind of contend with the Moonshae Isles themselves. You realize that there's a lot of inner politics as you're dealing with the local population. Your characters that you send could have specific jobs. So a cleric would be someone who works for the church there at that settlement, or a fighter, maybe a bodyguard or whatever. And you have kind of a way that your character fits into, an important role there. And it's not it's a little bit of an overall kind of, you guys are working together and building this fort up. But, he had a couple cool ideas with it. But the Moonshaes, I don't think have had a full, thorough campaign that ever took place in any of the settings.
I looked it up at one point, and I don't think there actually has been a full-blown campaign. I think there's been an adventure or two, possibly from, I believe, either Dungeon or Dragon Magazine. but I don't think there's been an actual release of any sort of adventure. I could be wrong. D&D has a very very long history. There's a lot to sift through, so there could be something there. But more importantly, I think that there could be something now. I think that we take a look at the Sword Coast, and all the time we see the Sword Coast, and we see the Moonshade Isles right there. And so far, we just haven't had any reason to go there. We haven't had any drive to go there. And I think that having something that's been on the map for the 5 years the fifth edition's been around, I think that could be a blast.
No, absolutely. And there's a lot of cool locations. I mean, if you look at the Faerun map, there's so much cool stuff here, and you see city names and stuff that hasn't been explored in official campaigns. And it sometimes is very inspiring to go and look at that and say, yeah, maybe I'm going to make a campaign around here, and let me see what information is about that area. And it can very much act as kind of a guiding a guiding tool to allow you to make some really, really cool adventures. And like seeing cool adventures being presented in those places, I think even sets more up of a good context of what is it like here, because ultimately Wizards of the Coast is going to be the final authority on their lore that they create, and seeing them actively creating stuff in areas that haven't been explored before, there's a sense of wonder for even veteran players, people who are very familiar with the lore. And there are areas that, unlike second edition, didn't really have sources built on them yet, or they don't have like very very thorough exploration of what's over there. And there's some information, but it's like just a new frontier, a new opportunity to create just a brand new area and a brand new consistency to what wizards are producing. And yeah, no, I think that like looking down here, there's like Kalimshan. There used to be, that's an older setting that I don't think has been explored in 5th edition, and there could be some really, really cool stuff in Kalimshan. Below there used to be a place called Halrua, which I don't think is, if this map is canonical, which I think it is.
I don't believe 5th edition's actually put out a Faerun map.
Have they not? Maybe not.
So.
They may just be that because this map that I sent you,
I believe that is from 3rd edition.
It has the this?
It's from, see, look, the tag is from 2008.
Yeah, but this isn't an official 3rd edition map, because I have an official 3rd edition map.
This might be 4th edition then.
That maybe I think that's
it probably is if it's from 2008.
Post Spell Plague. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. That'd be interesting. I would like for them to do that, so we can know if we're working off the 4th edition or 5th edition map. And that may be one of the reasons why they haven't explored other regions, is they haven't produced the 5th edition map. And they may not have any interest to. They may not want to, because it may tie them up in certain ways. They're like, okay, now we have to errata a lot of stuff because we did have the 4th edition map, and yeah, I don't know. It would be very interesting to know what their stance on something like that would be, or if there is any desire to produce something like that. And I can understand if they didn't want to. I'm perfectly fine with using the 3rd edition map as my source material. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, of course, we thrive in these worlds that Wizards of the Coast creates, but obviously we end up making our own canon. We end up shaping our world, and hopefully over the course of time, your players are slowly influencing the world that they thrive in. And those don't necessarily have to be world-changing ramifications. They could be something as simple as, oh, these heroes got themselves statues in all of the major towns or cities. And it could be something as major as whole cities are removed from the map, depending on, of course, the nature of your campaigns and what's going on in them. There is certainly a lot of things that can be world-shaping. And we talked a bit about, of course, the settings and stuff that we want to see. But what about mechanical side? We are thriving
Ooh.
in this 5th edition renaissance here because, lo and behold, the 4th edition didn't end up being too hot. I personally don't think 4th edition deserves nearly as much hate as it gets, but people love to hate. So, 5th edition is popping right now. Everyone loves 5th edition. It's easy to pick up, it's easy to learn, it's easy to play. There's a ton of customizability to it. It is what all the celebrities are playing. It is huge. But at some point down the line, they are going to have to sit down and make a 6th edition. So, do you have any idea what you'd want to see from a 6th edition of D&D?
A sixth edition. So I'm gonna say, you know, it's really hard to say, and especially to say without bias, because I played third, 3.5, and fifth, and it is. I like a lot of the third edition rules. I recognize there's a lot of issues with them. Um, at a certain power scale, things can get a little out of hand. But I think that fifth edition does some things that are very good as well. I like I like more saves. I like having each stat have a primary saving throw. It used to just be you had will, reflex, and fortitude, which was tied to your dex, wisdom, and constitution.
Yep.
Which made charisma a very easy dump stat for every single melee character because it didn't negatively. I mean, it affected your social skills a little bit, but not by a lot. Not in any way that would be as egregious as having a very low wisdom would affect you, because failing will saves were very, very bad. I would like to see maybe a return to scaling with caster level. I kind of mentioned that earlier in the episode. I think that's a good way to kind of help prevent a ton of power creep, because fireball is fireball, whether you're a 5th level wizard or a 10th level wizard. Fireball essentially is going to be fireball. Now you have some little sprinkle-ins, but it doesn't natively get any better, the spell itself, as you get higher level. I think I would like to see maybe something done about the bonus action.
Oh yes, the bonus action.
It feels. It feels like if your action is your hand, your bonus action is like a vestigial thumb, or like how dogs have their paw, and then they have that like dew claw that's like a vestigial like. I feel like the bonus action is, I think, because I like it a little bit, and I dislike it in the context that there are so many things tied to it. You can have character builds that are not viable. Specifically, a lot of dual wield builds do not mix well with builds that are very bonus action heavy, because your offhand attack is tied to your bonus action, and it's your choices. I either cast Shield of Faith and attack with my main hand, or I attack with my offhand and don't get the AC. And it kind of just comes down to a damage decision. I mean, and sometimes there's some more intricacies, but I think the bonus action is. It feels like it's 20% of your action that you sometimes get.
Yeah, it's really weird. It's a weird balancing act because the bonus action for some classes is used every single turn without question, always works. But there is, in fact, a lot of classes that never use the bonus action. If you are just a sword and shield fighter, the only reason you'd ever use the bonus action is for second wind. And if you are a wizard, the only time you're ever going to use a bonus action is if you have a specific spell that has you using the bonus action at some point during the casting. And it's really rare, and as you just mentioned, it is like 20% of your action. And it entirely depends, right? Like a paladins would only ever use a bonus action for those special little smites and really nothing much else. And the list goes on and on. But then of course you have the inverse, that where the monks are using the bonus action every turn because they want to punch and kick and headbutt and stuff. And then you have the dual wielders who are always trying to hit. And then you have the spellcasters that are always applying a bonus action. And then you have the bard that's always giving out the inspirations. And it was a weird design philosophy that the action like is applicable to a lot of things. You can use it to attack, you can use it to dash, disengage, hide, etc., etc. And then the bonus action was like, okay, we have this bonus action and we're only going to tie it to like, you know, two things that are applicable anywhere, and for the rest of them they're just going to be class based, which I mean, it's really hard. It's really interesting. It's really unique. I can't say if it's good or not. I think it's better than having nothing at all. But I think certainly something that could be really impactful would be something along the lines maybe Pathfinder did, where you have a 3-block action system, and certain actions you take eat up certain number of blocks of these actions. And whether that be attacking with an offhand is only 1 block, and then attacking with your main hand is 2, that allows you some versatility. Or whatever the case may be, maybe you expand that up to like 5 blocks, and an offhand attack is 1, a main attack is 1, but then the next main attack is 2, etc., etc. There's a lot of mechanics you can do in regards of using up your actions on your turn. But as of right now, on your turn, you've only got 3 options. You move, you action, you bonus action, and I guess you have a free action, but, that, once again, is a little bit weird. And it sucks not using all of your actions that you have available to you, because, once again, other people are using all of their actions available to them, and that sucks not being able to do everything that they can do. I don't... I mean, I'm not a game designer by any means, but, obviously a lot of people recognize that the bonus action's a weird one. Go on.
I was gonna say it is you have a lot of restrictions typically on the bonus action, because let's say you are playing a dual wielding character, and with your action you want to like staunch someone's wounds or make a medicine check to try and stop them from dying, and then you're like, okay, well then I use my bonus action to attack, but well you can't. You have to make an attack action and swing with your main hand before you can swing with your offhand. And there's a lot of restrictions on some things you can't do, some things you can do. Like what is the difference between attacking with my offhand, but a wizard being able to like cast a cantrip and damage someone, and then use another action or his bonus action to misty step away, right? It's very difficult to quantify what the bonus action is in terms of its sensitivity to how much time is passing in the round, because typically a round is about 6 seconds, or your turn, or I guess the full turn from beginning to end initiative is about 6 seconds. And how is that time being split up? And I think it's very difficult to quantify that with the bonus action. But again, it's like you said, without it, what would you have? Well, would you just have would you have just things be within an action setting, or would there be still an kind of an economic sense where you have 3 bars or 5 bars or however many certain things cost a quantifiable amount of stuff? How would you do that in a way that isn't intrusive? And I do like that idea where you have a set amount of that resource and your actions take up that resource. I think Divinity uses a similar system.
Yeah.
Where it is kind of like an action block.
I'm just thinking about it now, and like you just said, our typical round is 6 seconds. That makes me automatically think that every single block is a second. So you could have like 6 blocks in a round. Obviously the bigger you get in numbers, the more you can do with it, but obviously the more complex it gets. So that is
it's very complex,
very difficult balancing act there. But I definitely, like, now I'm thinking about it, I think 6 blocks of actions, and every single action you do either is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 actions. I certainly think that there is a lot of play material you can do with that. You could have, of course, the monk be, your punches only take up 1 block, and you can do this a number of times equal to your, like, I don't know, monk level rounded down or whatever. Like, depending on how deep you go into it, I'm sure there's a lot you can change alongside that.
Well, I think it's it's important to recognize too, if that is something that we would kind of push into sixth edition, how well would it be able to be balanced within what has already been introduced in fifth edition? Because now that fifth edition has come out, it very much is a it's out. It exists, and now going forward, it's always going to be compared to whatever edition comes afterwards, um, on its merit and how well it relates. I would say fifth edition and third edition relate very well together, even though they're a whole edition apart. They if you play third edition and then get into fifth edition, there is some things you need to retrain yourself on, but it is very similar. It's pretty much the same, same concept. Just the character progression's a bit different, and the that's most of it. And there's other things. There's a lot of other things, setting aside, but it's it is relatable, and you could probably teach someone fifth edition and then introduce them into third and teach them those similarities or the differences that there are, and they'd be able to pick it up as well. And I think you need to stay similar enough where someone is trying to learn it within the context of what they already know. So the block system, I think, could very easily, they say, we've kind of changed the action and bonus action, it's now a block economy. Kind of moving forward from that, this is how many it takes. Like a fighter, if you want to talk about like how their stuff scales, maybe their first attack, maybe most like just a normal melee attack takes up 3 blocks, right? And as the fighter goes on, his stuff costs less. And it's like, oh, once you hit to level 6, and a melee attack only costs 2 blocks, and then once you hit level whatever, it hits this much. And you can say like with a cap of 4 or something like that, and you can certainly make exceptions as you develop these rules. But I think that would be a very good modular system to figure out, how do we get out of the bonus action system where you have 2 things you can really do that are meaningful in your action economy, and some classes don't really have the bonus action at all. Like we were talking about earlier, Paladin has some things it can do, but they're mostly spells. Most of the casters are going to have bonus actions as spells. Rogues are probably going to be potentially using their bonus action every single turn. Monks are going to be using it very often. Barbarians, probably not as much. Rangers might also be someone who, depending on what your build is, if you're a dual wield ranger, you're probably going to be dual wielding every turn. So it definitely varies from class to class. But speaking of classes, for what I would also like to see in 6th edition, I would like to see some form of prestige class be reintroduced into D&D. I almost said into 5th edition.
Absolutely. I think I really like the idea of your so not a problem of 5th edition, but a design philosophy of 5th edition is that we talked about this much earlier on, is you are who you choose to be very early on, and then there is very little choice after that. There is some classes where you get some more choices later down the line, and this is typically more along the lines of spellcasters. They get to choose their spells, and that kind of solidifies what kind of spellcaster they are. But every once in a while, some of these other classes do get to pick certain weapons that they're proficient with, or they can pick a certain feature, like, for example, being the ranger. The ranger, later on, as they level up, they get the choice of either choosing A, B, or C. But typically, you are who you are at 3rd level. That's that. And you are typically looking along the lines of similar to everyone else. So I definitely think that if there was a prestige class system where as you leveled up, and depending on what classes you leveled up in, you could become a entirely different persona, that would be great for that versatility. You could have a fighter and they just level up fighter the whole time, and that's perfectly fine. But then you could have a fighter that multi-classes into paladin, and then they prestige into a holy knight or whatever you want to call it, right? And that has its own set of abilities and personas. And just having that variety for just variety's sake would be great, because in 5th edition, as of right this second, we have over 100 subclasses right now, which is pretty crazy to think that we're already up to 100 some odd subclasses. But when you honestly sit there and think about it, 100 subclasses divided between 11 classes, is that really that much variety? Because a lot of times, a lot of your classes simply go up and hit things. A lot of classes end up casting the same spells. A lot of classes, they share abilities, and there is some classes that actually straight up have the same ability. For example, being monks and rogues have evasion, and then you sit there and look at whatever
Bards
else,
can
right?
steal spells.
Yeah, but bards can straight up steal spells, right? And so they can just be better wizards. So having that ability to have a prestige class, which actively rewards you for going down a certain niche path, would be a blast. I think. I think there's a lot of design space you can just open up right there by saying, okay, if you want to be a holy knight there, then you have to be at least 5 levels paladin, 5 levels fighter, kind of thing, or obviously in 5th edition that wouldn't be that great. So in 6th edition, the entire class system would have to be reworked to reward you for that, because spoiler, in 5th edition multi-classing is kind of weak if you do specifically if you do it wrong, right?
There are some that are very strong, but for the most part, it's not as rewarding as it was in older editions.
Yeah. So yeah, prestige class is definitely something I would definitely consider. Something
Well,
I would like to see as well
go ahead.
is in prestige class, or not just prestige class, but also I don't want every level to be as impactful as it is in 5th edition. I want there to not be dead levels. Like, I want you to always be getting a little something, but I don't want it to be where you are just a level 1 noob and, a commoner could theoretically take you out, to all of a sudden you becoming a demigod in the span of a single level, right? I don't want you to be a level 4 nobody, and then all of a sudden you just hit this level where your power level just spikes through the roof. I want there to be a bit more gradual climb. I want there to be you slowly, obviously depending on the game that you're running. I want there to be a more slower, gradual climb,
Smoother transition. It's
Yeah.
not such a monstrous jump between gaining these levels, and that's why I like 3rd edition. Is everything is very gradual. Your extra attacks you gain in a round aren't tied to your specific level in the class you get. Because if you go 4 in barbarian and 1 in fighter, you don't get your second attack in a round. But in the way that older editions worked, is you would gain extra attacks in a round based on your base attack bonus, and each class had an assigned base attack bonus. It went 1/2, which was for wizards and sorcerers, 3/4 for monks, druids, bards, and rogues, and then I don't think there was another. Oh, and clerics as well. And then all the martial classes got 1 in a round. So you could theoretically say, like, I want to play an Eldritch Knight type character and go 4 into fighter and uh, 3 or 4 into wizard, and then you would still eventually get that second attack in a round as you level up into wizard. And so, you had a little more freedom into using the classes as an outlet to create the character you wanted to create, rather than saying, I need to pick, in order to, the class more dictating how your character is. Because I feel like 5th edition, a lot of your classes have a little bit more roleplay implication into who the character is, which is fine. But again, without the ability to multi-classes freely, you might not be as free to make the exact kind of character that you want to make.
For sure. And that the idea of freedom in these role-playing games is everything, right? We want to make whatever the frick we want. We want to be able to roll up terrible stats and be able to make something out of it. We want to sit down and have a concept of a character and realize it and make it come to life. And a lot of times you do have to do a bit of research. You have to sit down and say, okay, I want a knight. What class would a knight fit? And then you sit down and look and say, okay, there's pretty much like two classes that would fit the bill for what I'm aiming for here. And you definitely want to sit down and consider what does the class mean for the character, what does the character mean for the class, and what does this character and class combo mean for the world around you. Those are certainly things you have to consider, both not only as this player but also as the DM. What is this class? Is there fighters running around all over the place that are proficient in all weapons and they can pick up anything and do anything? They can wear all the weapons, they get all these battle tactics. Is that commonplace, or is it that every once in a while someone comes around and they're just a little bit better than anyone else? Is that wizard, are they from a prestigious school that they spent hundreds if not thousands of gold at to learn all these amazing spells? Or is it that this person was locked away in a broom closet and was able to flick a wand and cast a spell? There is a lot of things you need to consider about these classes and how they tie into the world around you. And I think lastly for me, for 6th edition, something I would want to see, and I know this would require a ton of work and would be pretty much like, I don't think it's realistic, but I would want to see it, is I want the simplicity and the complexity baked into the game, in regards of, you can sit there and say, okay, am I going to run a simplistic version of 6th edition or a complex version of 6th edition? Meaning that if you were to run the simplistic version of 6th edition, it would just be, you have very little skills, you have very little saves, you have very little, basically like all the numbers are significantly shorter, significantly smaller. The +2 attacks are smaller, the AC is smaller. Like basically, if you run simple edition, it is super duper easy to pick up and play. But at the same time, I want there to be a possibility that you can sit there and say, okay, I've got veteran players and they want to do more things. Let's run, a complex version of 6th edition. And already baked into the system without having to homebrew anything is the character sheet opens up essentially, and you get a lot more saves, you get a lot more skills, you get more abilities, you get more whatever the case may be, and just it adds more complexity to the game. I think having that versatility already baked into the system would be a great way to suck people in with the simplicity, and a great way for, of course, you to play with kids, or if you just want to play a real quick pickup game, whatever the case may be. But once you sit down and have a group of people that know what they want and want a lot more digestible content, a lot more crunch to the system, then the complexity is already there and you just simply switch on over. I think that would be certainly something to consider when making a 6th edition.
Well, I think as well, you can kind of look at it and say, just because 6th edition exists doesn't necessarily mean there's no reason to go back and play 5th edition. And I think 5th edition is particularly good because you can take someone who's not really familiar with D&D and they can pick it up pretty well. It's simple enough. It's the rules in the roles are there is enough kind of free form with it as to like what exactly an athletics check is or what exactly an acrobatics is. It's kind of a generalization, so it's very easy to kind of just apply that to anything that seems like it would be very relevant. And I think overall that is good, but I do think that people miss the days of having a separate spot and listen check. Now there are still more roles that need to be made, and I think part of that, I think we have to kind of realize where people are playing D&D nowadays too. I think a lot of people are now, especially with with the coronavirus going around, a lot of people are playing online, and playing online. Dice rolls are a lot quicker.
Yes.
There's a lot of systems that make playing D&D a lot more streamlined. And are they going to build 6th edition knowing that? And it may just be that they come out with a rule set that's a lot easier to run at the table, and maybe a rule set that comes out that's a lot easier to run in a digital environment. And that would be very interesting to see if they make that consideration. I think D&D will always have, the play at the table appeal. There's, playing at the table with people is a lot of fun. There's a lot of unique things that you can do at the table that you can't do over another program. But there's a lot of things that make running it online a lot more easy and a lot quicker. Not needing to do math and count dice. That every second you save on each dice roll that's rolled adds up so much.
Oh, yes.
And having that pace allows you to get through more of the game, and it's not in a rushed way. It's not something that you're needing to rush through. It's just conveniencing something that you no longer have to do. So yeah, I think it's there are advantages to doing both those ways, and I just would be very interested to see if Wizard takes that consideration into building 6th edition whenever they decide to build 6e. I had that. I mean, that's on the horizon.
That's definitely they realize that 5th edition is so successful right now because specifically, of course, not necessarily the community is making it big, but specifically the the famous people, all the famous nerds such as Critical Role and Joe Manganiello and whoever the frick else. These people are pushing 5th edition far harder than D&D has ever been pushed before, and they realize that they're going to ride this wagon for a while, and I think they're going to be smart about it. I think they're definitely going to keep on the 5e momentum train, and eventually they will, have to hop off and build the next new shiny thing to appeal to everyone. Alrighty, we've been talking a lot about what we want to see in the future in regards of modules and themes and settings and even 6th edition. But what I want to see right now is what you are going to transform this poor character into. So let's go ahead and take an update on this character, shall we?
Yeah, he's not looking too hot. I've gone with Wizard because the only good stat he has is intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And I went with Gnome. So the classical Gnome Wizard. But I've only got 3 HP at level 1. His name is Pa Perthin, which spells paper thin, because that is going to be his margin of life. I'm still deciding on the skills I'm going to take. I decided to go with the noble background, the one that has the retainers so they can carry him around. I believe the noble knight, so he is a knight, but he is one of those people from aristocracy that what are they? What is it? The thing where they bleed really easily.
Oh, he's anemic.
That like some
no, is that no
anemics where they don't have a lot.
They
of
don't
blood.
have.
He doesn't have a lot of that either. He's got very little of that. But he's got, I think it's like hemophilia or something like that.
Hemophiliac, yeah.
Where he just any little like injury is potentially fatal for him. So he has his retainers help him around and do things for him, so he doesn't risk injury. I have chosen his spells. So I've taken Dancing Lights, Firebolt, and Minor Illusion. So some utility with a little bit of damage option. I don't want to make a character that can't do damage. And his first level spells to start out with are Charm Person and False Life, because the False Life roll honestly could more than double my HP. So I think it's what 3D or what 1d4 plus 4.
1d4
oh yeah,
plus 4. That's
absolute minimum roll at least. I could potentially almost triple my HP,
and that's important because this guy without False Life, if he takes 6 HP, 6 points of damage, he's dead. Simple as that.
Let's just say he has it precast. Let's see how he does. Oh, he's got 8 HP. He's feeling, his cheeks aren't as sallow. Maybe he looks like he is doesn't have that bad cough. Maybe he's
he's putting on a false appearance of his true self.
Exactly. This poor creature.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think once again, like, that character building really helps define the world around you, right? For example, what are noble knights in this universe? Are noble knights in your universe these proud individuals who go out and slay dragons? Or are they all just aristocrats that all lie and are totally not noble and not pure? And in fact, in the case of this guy in particular, he's just a scrawny weakling who has people carrying him around. And then you can also play into the fact that the whole spells adding to the roleplay implications of your world. Maybe the reason why this false life spell exists is purely because there's a whole bunch of people who are lying about what they actually look like. And, these maybe these old people cast false life on themselves and then go out and then they look good. But then as soon as the spell wears off, then all of a sudden they revert to their poor old form. And of course, once again, in the case of this character, he's just this sickly individual. So he needs to put on an appearance for his people. I think that really leads into the roleplay and flavor of the character and in the world implications around you. And I just think that's absolutely fantastic.
Well, I think it shows too, especially with a lot of the utilities, so long as you have at least one good primary stat. Even with only 3 HP, this character won't be completely useless.
Absolutely.
Will he have the same shelf life? No. Will he need to stay out of combat more? Absolutely. But he can still be relevant. And beyond that, even if he's not a character that's important combat-wise, if you take the right skills and you apply them and you really apply yourself into the role play, he may not be a character that is expected to fight. Maybe he is the one to talk people down. I did look at his skills. I did decide on those. So I've got proficiency in Arcana, History, Persuasion, and Religion. So he's kind of, he knows a lot about stuff. He's kind of persuasive. He's not very good at other things. He's not very perceptive, and survival is very bad. Luckily there are no constitution-based skills because he would be at a -3 or whatever that is. But he is good in other things, so you could definitely play to your character's strengths. Now, obviously, in a situation like this, when you're rolling down the line, you don't really always have that option, but that's more to the character creation process in the game in the games you're playing in. But just know what you're getting into. This character is pretty bad, but he's not. He could be much worse. It could be so much worse.
That's the thing to consider too. Is like this individual character on paper doesn't look that impressive, especially when you're looking at the HP, of course. But when you consider if everyone at the table is rolling for stats, and specifically if they are rolling down the line, then inevitably you are going to have a lot of people that just suck. And I think that's a really great group building exercise of, okay, we all rolled, some decent-ish stats and we all rolled some terrible stats. What kind of adventuring group can we make with these stats? Right now we're building this process of one character at a time. But if you do this with a group of 3, 4, 5 people, then you sit down and say, okay, we have 2 people that have really terrible physical stats, so we definitely want to leverage them to be more of the caster types. And we have 1 person who is just got that godly tier strength. He's going to be our paladin. And then we have this person who's got this really great constitution, and then we say, okay, she's going to be the barbarian. And obviously, these are just one-off cases. You can have those times where these stats line up well enough that they could be multiple things, and you have to slot them in, and you have to round out the group. And that is a great group-building exercise of literally building the characters together and just, compare and contrast what you have. And I think that's a ton of fun. I think it's great when you have to sit down and say, okay, obviously my character is not destined for greatness in the physical world here. What else can I do? Because realistically, if you look at this character, you could have gone down a dexterity route. Although it wouldn't have been the greatest dexterity route. I think a cool design here would have been, you could have been an elf and you could have been like a bladesinger because you have a decent dexterity. Or if you had decided to go down the more warlock route, you could have taken a race that gives you charisma, etc., etc. And you obviously have a stat that is better than the others, but you don't have to play to it. 14 intelligence going up to 16 because your gnome is fantastic, of course, though. So why not take it?
Well, sometimes you need to lean in to the things you're good at, and sometimes it's good maybe not in combat context, but maybe well, in okay, well, I'll make the exception that sometimes you do want to do some things in combat that you're not the best at because it's your only option. But sometimes in like a social encounter, yeah, go for it. Like roll history if you're not good at history. Maybe there's like a test of strength, and there's like a bar thug who's arm wrestling people. That's okay. Go if you're not the strongest character, go and do it. Sometimes it can be very, very rewarding to have a character who has their stats against them, and then you succeed anyway. Um, it's actually it can be a lot of fun, and people at the table remember it because the underdog did something that was, unexpected, and those sometimes are memories that last for a long time.
One of my underdog stories, which funnily enough happened as the NPCs, sadly, so this is not a story of epic heroes doing epic things, was in the campaign that I just DM'd for you. You guys got into a drinking competition with a whole bunch of commoners. And the funniest part about this was you guys collectively, mind you, this drinking contest was a test of constitution. It was constitution checks and saves. And my party all had really good con. They all were rolling plus 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever the case might be. And the commoners with plus 0 beat them. And that was just, obviously that was it was hilarious for me, but, my players were like, oh man, what, plus, how are these commoners beating us? But I rolled out in the open and they saw it firsthand that even if you do have those really high stats, then you can lose. Obviously, usually look at it in the context of your players are going up against people that have better odds and then them overcoming it. But if it can be the reverse as well. You can have your players be the absolute awesome people, but lose out to people that are hitting with only plus ones and twos. That happens. That's sort of the reason why we play these games. If it was guaranteed that because you were better you won, that would take a lot of the variability out of the game. We roll a 20-sided dice because we want variety. At some point, role-playing games were using only d6s to determine what happened, but a d6 isn't enough variety. We want more. Eventually, it evolved into d8s and d10s, d12s, d20s, and there's many role-playing systems that even use d100s, and those work out perfectly fine. We love that variety. And I only just briefly mentioned this, but I think there's a very important topic here of to roll in the open as a DM or to roll hidden.
It is a controversial topic, and
yes.
Again, it very much it's very much is about the group you're playing for. I myself deign to roll in the open. It keeps me fair. It makes the players don't think that I might be cheating or fudging my rolls, because there's nothing worse than when you're rolling behind the screen and the player gets crit twice in a row, and then 2 attacks later they get crit again, and they're like, then it becomes the onus of, well, as a DM, are you supposed to ignore that crit? Well, if that's the case, why roll at all? And if everybody's seeing the rolls out in the open, there's no guesswork. It's just like, there it is. This is how it plays. And so I think some players can see that as like it's a me versus the DM sort of thing, which I don't think most people should have that mentality. But it just shows you that the DM isn't cheating. It just conversely, if the monster rolls low and misses, you're not worried about the DM being like, oh, well, it actually hits, So there's no opportunity for any kind of accusation that the DM is pulling some shady stuff.
Absolutely. I can easily tell you every DM that ever rolls behind the screen, every DM that hides the rolls, every single one of them has fudged a roll at some point. Whether that be for the good of the party or against the party, it doesn't matter. They have lied. And the thing you got to consider is, as a DM, you're trying to forge the story together. You're trying to make this story. And the dice play into how that story operates. So you got to consider, if we are going into that combat, and I just sit there and I roll crit after crit. I'm maxing out on damage. I'm succeeding on all these saving throws, and I dunk on the party. If I sit there and keep it true to word that, oh, I rolled these and I'm going to have some integrity here and keep whatever I roll, are you forging a good story? And sadly, if you are in one of those scenarios where you are dunking on the party, you can sit there and say, "Hey, I was integral, and I said whatever I rolled." But unfortunately, that story might suck. It might suck that your players get to the big bad evil guy, and then they just lose because you just had a hot streak, and more importantly, your players had a terrible cold streak. But at the same time, the inverse happens when you roll out in the open. If you roll out in the open, then whatever you roll goes, and you have to work with that. And obviously, you try and create these scenarios where you aren't going to ruin the campaign by just a set of rolls. But inevitably, specifically in combat, because combat's so swingy, that does happen. And you will have those times where that enemy succeeds every single saving throw, even if they have terrible pluses to their saves, or even minuses sometimes. You have those characters that are just going to get crits and constantly hit people and do a whole bunch of damage, and you have to sit there and accept that fate. It's an exercise in the type of story that you're trying to tell. I personally, for the majority of my DMing career, have rolled out in the open. And what that means is I am forced to sit there and accept it. And a lot of times that does suck. Well, not a lot of times, but there's a lot of times where it does suck. It definitely, you have to consider the ramifications that at any given point, because you cannot fudge the dice, at any given point, because you cannot sit there and change the world around you, that the game could end, or there could be some horrible roleplay implications that happen. But at the same time, it is rewarding in that sense, because once again, you don't want there to ever be a DM versus player, thought process, right? You always want it to be that the DM and the players are working together to forge an awesome story. So does rolling out in the open versus rolling in private help or hinder that process? I mean, once again, much like with a lot of things here, it comes down to the relationship that the DM and the players have. If you have a group of players that trust the DM and know that they want to tell an amazing story, then having them roll in privately is sometimes better, because you don't have to worry about the game ending for an arbitrary reason, and you don't have to worry about a suicidal combat being done in a single round. You can extend that over a period of time. You can have world-changing events all around you. But in public, just when you roll in the open, everything that is thrown goes, and that's that end of story.
Yeah, and it keeps the experience organic. I think everyone comes down to the table, hopefully knowing at least the basics of the game before they actually start playing in their first serious campaign, and knowing the way the game is played, and it kind of rounds back what we talked about earlier. Is the rules of the game are what makes it fun. And if the rules are changing, or if one party isn't sticking to the rules or staying within what the rules dictate, then why have rules at all? And I think that, the DM needs to kind of recognize that, again, it's like you said, it depends on who you're running it for. But the DM needs to recognize, the implications of both rolling out in the open and rolling behind the screen. One of my groups wanted me to roll behind the screen. They're like, yeah, so if you ever need to like fudge something, and I'm like, no, like, now I'm gonna roll out in the open now. Like, I think that your integrity is on the line. At least it is to you, and you have to dictate what that means. So, but again, it really depends what your group wants, what you want, how you're running the game, because there's a lot of different ways that you can that you can appeal to your party, and sometimes that in itself is one of those things.
Absolutely. And something to harp on is, like I said, every DM that rolls behind the screen cheats and lies, every single one. Like, whether it be just a single little time and it's just a quick little white lie, there is going to be some lying. There's no question about it, because if you're rolling behind the screen and you're not lying, then what's the point in the first place? But something to consider is, if you do roll behind the screen and your players at some point ask you, "Oh, did you fudge any rolls?" You tell them no. You never tell them when the fudge is happening, because they have to believe that at any given point everything happened because of randomness and chance. And if you start revealing when you change the dice rolls, they're going to start noticing the patterns of favoritism. They're going to start noticing the story beats of, if I do this, is the world going to magically make sure that I'm safe and sound? And you can't let them in on the magic. They know, your players presumably know, specifically in Stan's case anyway, they know that there is some magic going on behind the screen there, and they know that something's changing, but you just can't let them in on it. You just can't. It ruins the mystery of the game.
And there's a lot
And
more burden on you as a DM.
absolutely, it's definitely a lot you have to sit down and weigh in regards of the integrity of the story versus the integrity of, I guess, yourself. Not to say, as DMs, we are, not just as DMs anyway, but everyone that sits down to play a role playing game, you are lying to some degree. You're not that character. You're not this individual. You're acting. You're doing something here. And, that whole idea of rolling behind the screen and changing the results is part of the act. It is definitely, you are running an improv comedy show, but every once in a while you hold up a little placard here and try and move along with a certain beat that you have in mind. It can't always be improv, because if you ran a game that's purely improv, then you're going to run into a lot of walls real quick, and your DM creative juices are going to start running out pretty soon. It's a lot you have to consider, especially if you're running a long-term campaign of, if they fail at this one action, if this one enemy gets away, if they just straight up get TBK'd or whatever, there is a lot to consider.
Well, and on that point too, sometimes consider what outs your characters might have. Is this enemy going to be somebody who's just going to just kill the characters? I mean, if it's like a T-Rex or something like that, maybe, yeah. Is this someone who is operating outside of the law? Is it that they want the money? Or would they capture the party? And there, think about ways that you could potentially make this into something that isn't as bad. And if you're very intent on continuing the story, but sometimes contextually it's just like, look, this is an enemy that has no intention of parlaying once you're dead, and he's going to kill and eat you. Sometimes that's how it goes.
Absolutely. And, it's always coming back to the expectation of your game. You are going to have to sit down right from the get-go and say, hey, is this something that we want? Is this something that we don't want? You don't want to, I mean, you can have those games where you roll privately and then every once in a while you do roll publicly, or vice versa. You can have those games, but typically you just want to stick to one thing and just keep it as is, because it's tough. It really is tough. Fifth edition doesn't provide us a specific reason to roll in public or roll in private. There are some game systems where the DM is actually supposed to be rolling for the characters to certain degrees. And in fact, in earlier editions of D&D, that was sort of the standard. You, as the DM, would roll for their perception checks. And I certainly think that there's a lot of merit to rolling the characters' perception checks for them, because if you have them roll perception checks, then invariably they are going to start metagaming. They are going to know, okay, if they DM asks for a perception check, then obviously there's something here. And whether they act on that metagaming knowledge or not, that's entirely up to them, but they are going to know. So just sitting there and rolling behind the screen and dictating the outcome of the dice roll is certainly a consideration to have in mind. Once again, that comes down to the arbitration of the rules. If you sit there and say, okay, I'm going to roll behind the screen, and if they roll bad on this perception check, then they get ambushed. But if you're rolling behind the screen, are you going to have that integrity of adhering to whatever you rolled? Or are you just going to simply sit there and create a story of you spot the ambush at the last second, or you just get ambushed? And, that keeps on leading back into the story that you're trying to tell, the game expectations that are all about here. And that is really all it comes down to, is the game that you're trying to run and the game that your players are playing in. It is a conjoined effort. It is a monumental task. They have to sit down and consider everything in store for what this game is going to be. And it takes a lot of time, effort, and patience to forge this amazing game with your players. This is, and once again, the DM is also a player. The DM is part of this group. It is not DM versus player. It is the DM with the players. You guys are combined in trying to forge this amazing story. And I think, wrapping up on this session here, this individual episode here, I think we should go ahead and reflect on what it means to forge epic tales by showing off epic characters. So let's go ahead and take our last look at Pa Perthin here.
So Pa Perthin, yeah, he's he's got these stats. There are some positive ones. There are more negative than positive stats. But that's okay. He's of noble birth. He was destined to be a rock gnome knight, but he has congenital issues, and he is paper thin, you could say. He's got some nice spells. He has a lot of utility spells. He has a firebolt just in case he needs to properly defend himself, and most of his daily work is done by his retainers.
Absolutely.
Only 3 HP though at level 1. What a character.
You can get killed by a kobold if they roll high on their attack.
I'm more likely to die because I go into my negative HP than fail my death saves.
Yes.
That's really something to think about.
You take 5 HP and below, you're perfectly alive. 6 and up, you're dead. Simple as
What's scary, too, about this character is at this level, he has the highest resilience. Because I only get 1 HP after this every single level. So by the time I'm level 10, I have 13 HP. What do you think about that, Trevor? What do you think about that? That's like where your fighter is when he starts if he's got a high con.
Yes.
At level 10.
That is a 16 con fighter. Woo! That is a 12 con barbarian.
That's a pretty bad character right here. But again, kind of rounding back just a little bit of what we talked about. How amazing would it be if this character was able to just organically forge ahead?
Absolutely.
Getting a character like this to level 10 would be a feat most D&D players would shudder at.
Absolutely. There's always the consideration when you're doing roll for stats is if you roll a god character, you roll 2 18s, your lowest stat is 10, you are a badass, you are the epic hero. The thing is, if that person ends up becoming the epic hero, then that's to be expected. If they end up being the awesome big person in the entire group, then that's whatever. But if you get a character like this, you get this character with multiple negative stats, and specifically if it's a negative con here, and they go on to do great deeds, that character is far more memorable. You want to see the zeros become heroes. You don't want to see the heroes that, already become heroes. That's whatever. And that's personally why I like the implications of rolling for stats here. Maybe not necessarily for every campaign, of course. It definitely has its place. It has its purpose. But I think rolling for stats can create these ideas for characters and really leads into the world building and specifically the character building. And I think that is just an epic way to handle things. So yeah, that is 2 characters down now. We have a nice little assortment of characters. We have a Veldug the Lucky, a pretty decent cleric mountain dwarf who only had 2 negative stats only. And now we've got Popper Thin, a individual who is definitely, not someone that goes out all the time, but they are certainly a delight when they go out.
They're both short characters. What do you know? Both small races.
Absolutely. So yeah, that is going to wrap it up for this episode of the Roll for Stats podcast. Thank you so very much for everyone that listened. I certainly had a blast filming this, and I certainly can't wait for more because there's a lot more characters to forge. There's a lot more things to talk about in the world of role playing and whatever else. And I just can't wait to do more. So thank you to all the viewers, and thank you to all my lovely patrons listed here. Stan, you got anything more to say?
No, just if you haven't already, No Fun Allowed here is he's got a Patreon. Go ahead and take a look at it and see. I'm pretty sure that there are some neat things that you get access to.
Absolutely.
But yeah, no, thank you guys very much for listening. That's all I got to say.
Alrighty, thank you. Alrighty, that is gonna do it for this video. Thank you I'm stammering over my words here. I'm so emotional at the end here. Thank you so very much for watching, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.